It was just after midnight when the alarm triggered inside a multi-million-dollar Manhattan penthouse. No signs of a break-in. No calls for help. But by the time security arrived, the owner was already gone. A few weeks later, a young woman walked out of a nightclub and never made it home. Her last known message was timestamped at 2:14 a.m. Her friends thought she'd called a taxi. But her phone stopped transmitting just minutes later. And her case would stay cold, for 8 long years. Across the ocean, a newborn was found abandoned behind a supermarket loading dock. Wrapped in a towel. No note. No trace. No name. For 25 years, his identity was a mystery, until technology revealed a truth no one expected. A man with a steady job, a quiet life, and a loving family suddenly disappeared. His wife claimed he had left for work and never came back. Weeks passed. Then came the smell. A sealed container. And a discovery so gruesome, police refused to comment for days. In Paris, an art student left her friend's apartment for a short walk through a public park. She never arrived at her dorm. A week later, her body was found beneath the trees, and what investigators uncovered led them to a man already on the run. And then, there's the beach. Miles of wind-blown sand. An endless coastline littered with fragments of lives cut short. For decades, people searched for answers. And in 2023, the search finally led to a quiet man with a family of his own. But many still believe. The story isn't over. Some of these cases are solved. Others remain open. All of them leave questions that refuse to fade. Whispered line, layered over the soundscape. These are 6 of the most disturbing true crime stories, designed to haunt you as you sleep. If you find yourself drawn to the quiet tension of the unknown, if the sound of rain helps the horror settle in just a little easier, make sure to subscribe, and turn on notifications. We begin with a man whose empire was built on secrets. And who died surrounded by them. Story 1. Rain falls steady over the New York skyline. A constant hush against the glass. The streets below are quiet, save for the occasional taxi sweeping through the wet pavement. It's a Sunday night. The kind of night where the city feels paused. Still. At 2:07 a.m., the private elevator to the top floor of the Atria, one of Manhattan's most exclusive residential towers, made its final trip for the night. There was only one resident on that floor. Samuel Hart. Security logs show the elevator reached the penthouse. The doors opened. Then nothing. No record of it moving again until after dawn. Samuel was one of the youngest self-made billionaires in the country. A tech entrepreneur, known just as much for his innovations as he was for his silence. He rarely gave interviews. He rarely showed up at his own product launches. But everything he built, worked. And behind closed doors, those closest to him said the same thing, he was always 3 steps ahead. That night, no one heard from him. No calls. No messages. Nothing. At 7:48 a.m., a member of his security team entered the penthouse to prepare for a breakfast meeting Samuel had scheduled days earlier. They walked into silence. The apartment was immaculate. Lights still dimmed. A cup of untouched espresso sat on the marble counter, still warm to the touch. Music played softly from the living room speakers, an instrumental piece from a composer no one could immediately name. His phone was resting face down on the table. His laptop was open. Logged in. The television screen frozen on a paused news segment about artificial intelligence. And then, there was Samuel. He was lying face up near the sliding glass doors that overlooked the city. A blanket from the couch had been pulled across his lower body, as if someone had tried, at the last moment, to make him more comfortable. But there were no obvious injuries. No chaos. No broken glass. The windows were all locked from the inside. Emergency services were called at 7:56 a.m. By the time they arrived, the apartment had already been cleared. The team was told to stay quiet. To wait for instructions. Across the hall, in a neighboring suite owned by an executive from Hart's company, the blinds remained shut. The occupant wasn't home. Samuel's official time of death was marked at 3:12 a.m. But almost nothing about that morning made sense. Not to his staff. Not to his family. And certainly not to the two detectives who were first assigned to the case. Because Samuel Hart wasn't just a man with money. He was working on something big. A project that, just weeks earlier, had been quietly revealed to a small circle of investors behind closed doors. And according to one of them, he seemed nervous. The rain hadn't let up. It clung to the windows of the city's tallest towers like a veil, muting the skyline and turning glass into mirrors. Inside the precinct, the fluorescent lights cast a washed-out glow across case files already starting to stack up. But by mid-morning, all focus had shifted. Samuel Hart's name wasn't just familiar, it was etched into the fabric of modern life. Millions of devices ran on platforms he'd developed. His earliest innovations had disrupted industries overnight. He wasn't loud, but he was effective. Clean-cut. Calculated. Unshakably private. His fortune had come fast. But what stood out wasn't just how much he'd earned. It was how little anyone truly knew about how it all worked. He rarely traveled. He rarely spoke publicly. And yet, somehow, his influence reached from boardrooms in Tokyo to satellites orbiting the planet. Detectives quickly learned that just 2 weeks prior to his death, Samuel had held a confidential briefing with 6 individuals, venture capitalists, government advisors, and a single foreign representative whose name was never officially disclosed. What was discussed in that room hadn't made it into any official reports. But those who attended remembered one thing: Hart seemed uneasy. Detached. At moments, distracted. Inside the penthouse, security footage covering the front door stopped recording just before midnight. No technical failure. No alerts. The feed resumed the next morning, as if nothing had happened. The backup drives, removed. Not stolen. Removed cleanly, with administrative credentials. The company's chief technology officer, someone who had worked beside Hart since the beginning, claimed it was impossible. Their system wasn't just advanced, it was uniquely designed by Hart himself. A signature of his obsession with control. Then came the whispers. A project known only by its internal codename, Lyra. Described as something that could reshape how digital systems learn from human behavior. Hart had been working on it privately for over a year. Only a handful of people even knew it existed. One of those people was Marcus Thorne, a former lead engineer who had been dismissed 8 months earlier under quiet circumstances. No public announcement. No lawsuits. Just gone. At the time, he'd told close friends that Samuel had made a mistake, that Lyra was too ambitious. That someone would get hurt. Marcus became the first real suspect. He had motive. Technical knowledge. A clear grudge. Surveillance picked him up in Chicago just 2 days after Hart's death. He didn't run. He didn't hide. And when questioned, he told investigators he hadn't seen or spoken to Hart in almost a year. His alibi checked out. Every detail matched. He had been at a wedding, surrounded by hundreds of people, all on camera. When asked about Lyra, he went quiet. But eventually, he said this: "Whatever happened to Sam, he saw it coming. I think that's why he built it the way he did. So if something ever went wrong, someone else would know." Then came the autopsy. At first glance, nothing stood out. No trauma. No foreign substances in the bloodstream. But additional toxicology flagged something unusual. A compound so rare, it took a week to identify. It was synthetic. Undetectable in routine screenings. Disrupts nerve signals in the brainstem. Leaves no trace after a few hours. It had been used once before, in an unrelated espionage case overseas. But what caught the coroner's attention wasn't just the chemical. It was the dosage. Precise. Measured. Delivered in a way that suggested the person administering it had studied Samuel closely. It wasn't random. It was calculated. And whoever had done it without leaving a mark. The investigation stretched into weeks. Then months. Dozens of interviews. Hundreds of hours of security footage, server logs, internal messages, all examined, catalogued, archived. Nothing definitive ever surfaced. The apartment building's security system had no record of anyone else entering or leaving. No DNA. No fingerprints that didn't belong. No weapon. The neurotoxin, traced back to a research lab overseas, had never been reported missing. The manufacturer denied any sales or leaks. On paper, it didn't exist. Samuel's family refused public comment. His company issued a single statement, acknowledging his passing and promising continuity. The board of directors was reshuffled quietly. Stock prices surged. Investors seemed more confident than ever. But one detail continued to raise questions. Inside Hart's personal server, investigators found fragmented code. Files marked with the codename Lyra. Encrypted, but partially reconstructed. A project built not just to respond, but to adapt. Artificial learning architecture unlike anything the Bureau's digital forensics team had ever seen. It was incomplete. But the way it was written, suggested the system could rewrite itself in real time. No documentation. No known collaborators. The prototype itself, gone. His backup drives had been removed. Not just from the penthouse, but from the company's secure vaults. 4 devices, each containing a portion of the project. All of them accounted for in quarterly audits. Now, none could be located. And there was one more detail. The night before his death, Samuel had sent a single encrypted email. It wasn't recovered from his main account, but flagged through external routing logs. The recipient address was masked. No known alias. The message contained no text. Only a file. That file has never been opened. Authorities won't confirm where it is, or if they still have it. And when contacted, the Department of Cyber Intelligence declined to comment. To this day, no arrests have been made. No suspects officially named. The toxicology report remains classified. His apartment has been resold. His digital presence, wiped by legal order. But those who knew Samuel Hartwell say the same thing: he never made mistakes. He planned for every possibility. Every outcome. The case is still unsolved. But what happened to the prototype Samuel was working on remains even more mysterious. Story 2. The frost had settled thick across the rooftops that morning. In the quiet town of Warrington, England, everything looked still. White lawns. Frozen hedges. The kind of winter cold that makes sound carry farther and footsteps linger longer. It was December 14, 1998. At 5:46 a.m., the loading crew at a supermarket arrived to start their shift. They parked in the rear lot, as they always did, stepping over patches of black ice and pulling their collars up against the chill. The loading bay was tucked behind the store, barely visible from the road, shielded by high fences and dumpsters. A few minutes later, someone noticed it. A white towel. Folded once, placed carefully between 2 crates near the back steps. It looked out of place, too clean, too deliberate. One of the workers thought it might be trash. Another thought maybe someone had dropped it while unloading stock. Then they heard the sound. A faint, breathless whimper. Inside the towel was a newborn boy. Pale. Motionless. But alive. He was rushed to the hospital. The doctors said it was a matter of minutes. Any longer, and the cold would have taken him. He had no clothes. No note. No name. No identifying marks. Nothing. They called him Callum. The police issued public pleas. Posters went up. Officers visited nearby homes and clinics. Every woman who had recently given birth was discreetly contacted. Hospitals checked their records. But no one came forward. No one had seen anything. No one reported anything missing. The footage from the store's security cameras was grainy. One angle showed a figure, hooded, walking fast, carrying something. The timestamp read 3:12 a.m. less than 3 hours before Callum was found. The image was never enhanced. The person's face, never seen. He was placed into emergency foster care. For a while, the media covered his story, calling him, the baby in the towel, the Christmas miracle, the child who shouldn't have survived. And then, like so many unsolved cases, the headlines faded. The case stayed open. But quietly. The file remained on the shelves for years, marked with a single word, unidentified. And as Callum grew, so did the silence around his past. He would later be told the truth in pieces, through cautious conversations, gentle explanations, and redacted letters. No one could explain why it had happened. No one knew who had left him there. And after 2 decades, few believed they ever would. But what no one realized, not the detectives, not the doctors, not even Callum himself, was that somewhere, stored in an anonymous government database, a single entry had already begun to match. For 25 years, his name was a quiet echo in police records and child welfare reports. Callum grew up in a loving home. He was adopted young, given opportunities, protected from the harsher truths of his beginning. But for those involved in the original investigation, there was always a wait. The detectives still remembered the look on the baby's face. The nurses still talked about the day he arrived in the ward, skin like porcelain, heart barely holding on. In Warrington, the case had never fully faded. It became part of the town's memory. A tragic mystery that was whispered during winter months or mentioned when someone brought up unsolved cases. Every few years, there'd be a new tip. A caller. A letter. But each one ended the same way, with more questions than answers. Until 2025. It started with something simple. A government-run DNA tracing program. Designed to help reunite adopted children with biological families, if both parties opted in. Callum submitted his sample after encouragement from his partner. He was hesitant, unsure, but curious. Weeks passed. Then the call came. A match. Partial at first. Then confirmed. A woman living under a different name. The system flagged her due to a prior medical sample stored in a hospital's archival system, one that had never been connected to any crime, but was still legally viable. Joanne Sharkey. She was 46 now. Married. 2 children. Known locally as a quiet, reserved woman. No history of violence. No criminal record. Her name had never come up during the original investigation. When police arrived at her home, she didn't resist. She didn't run. She asked for a moment to speak with her husband privately, then returned to the living room and sat down. Her words were quiet. Unrushed. The officers said she didn't cry. But her voice trembled as she answered every question, even the ones they hadn't asked yet. She had given birth alone, in secret, at home. She was 19. Terrified. The father had disappeared weeks earlier. Her parents, strict and unrelenting, had no idea she was pregnant. She had hidden it, baggy clothes, skipped meals, silence. No prenatal care. No support. No plan. After the birth, she said she wrapped the baby in the only thing she could find, an old towel from the cupboard. She walked for nearly an hour in the freezing dark. She didn't know where to go. Her hands were numb. Her thoughts, she said, weren't her own. The details came out slowly, painfully, over a series of interviews. Joanne had suffered what doctors later confirmed was an acute episode of postnatal depression, so severe it bordered on psychosis. At the time, it had no name. No diagnosis. No help. She described the hours after the birth as a blur of panic and guilt, where the idea of asking for help felt like something worse than death. She left the baby behind the supermarket because, in her words, she thought someone would find him. She believed it was safer than taking him back home. She never imagined he'd survive the night. For years, she carried the silence like a secret stitched into her bones. And when Callum's name came up again in the news, when the DNA match was confirmed, she didn't deny him. She said only this: "I never stopped thinking about him. Every time I saw a boy that age, I wondered." The case sparked national debate. News outlets ran headlines filled with judgment, others with compassion. Mental health advocates urged understanding. Legal analysts questioned whether the justice system could, or should, measure something like this in simple terms of guilt or innocence. In court, she pleaded guilty. Not to murder, but to infanticide, under a statute that recognized the psychological state of a mother during or shortly after childbirth. The judge called her actions heartbreaking, but not evil. The sentence: community supervision. Mandatory psychiatric care. No prison time. Callum didn't speak publicly, but sources close to him said he attended one of the hearings. Quietly. From the back row. No cameras. No reporters. And when it was over, he left without saying a word. What remains is a case that defies easy explanation. It's not one of cruelty or vengeance. It's something else. Something that makes people sit in silence for a moment after hearing it. Was it justice, or was it heartbreak? Let us know in the comments. Story 3. The morning air in Corser was heavy with mist. The streets were still. Shops unopened. Church bells silent. It was July, yet the sky was the color of steel, blank and quiet. A man walking his dog near the train station noticed the phone first. It was lying on the edge of the sidewalk, screen cracked, still glowing. It hadn't rained, but the grass was damp from condensation. A single sneaker was found nearby, half sunken into the soil beside the path. The time was 6:12 a.m. By the end of the hour, police had roped off the area. The phone was locked. The shoe, size 37, matched the description of what 17-year-old Emily Meng had been wearing the night before. She was last seen just a few blocks away, on surveillance footage leaving the Slagelse train station around 4 a.m. after a night out with friends. The camera caught her crossing the platform, adjusting her jacket, glancing briefly toward the parking lot. Her train had arrived late. The next one home wasn't due for another hour. She didn't call anyone. She didn't text. She just walked into the fog. No one saw her after that. Emily was a bright, curious girl. A talented pianist. She had just finished her second year at gymnasium. Friends described her as warm, funny, a little quiet but deeply loyal. That night, she had said goodbye to her group just outside the station. They offered to wait, but she told them not to worry. Her house was close. Less than a 15-minute walk. The distance between the station and her front door would later become the center of the investigation. Every meter scrutinized. Every bush. Every lamppost. Officers walked the route over and over again, tracing where she might have gone, what turn she might have taken, how someone could have intercepted her without anyone noticing. But there were no immediate answers. In the days that followed, the town changed. Posters went up across windows, bus stops, school hallways. Volunteers formed search parties, combing through fields, alleyways, and shorelines. The local cafe stopped serving at noon to host coordination meetings. Even children helped, drawing pictures and handing out flyers. Her parents appeared on television. Her younger sister stood beside them, clutching a photo. The family home was surrounded by journalists, police, neighbors who brought food but didn't know what to say. Weeks passed. Then months. And still, nothing. No phone activity. No credit card use. No witnesses. Emily Meng had vanished in a country known for its safety. In a town where people left their doors unlocked. On a street she'd walked 100 times before. And the questions only grew louder. Where did she go after the cameras lost sight of her? Who was awake in Corser that night, and watching? She had spent the evening laughing. Photos from that night show her in denim shorts and a pale sweater, sitting with friends on the grass outside a music venue. A soda can in her hand, strands of her hair falling over one eye. It was one of those warm Scandinavian nights where it feels like the sun never fully sets. She texted her sister around midnight, "Don't wait up. I'll be quiet." Then later, to a friend, "Still waiting for the train. Dead phone soon. See you tomorrow." They were the last messages she would ever send. By sunrise, her room was still empty. At first, her mother assumed she'd stayed over at a friend's house. That maybe she'd missed the last train and made a quick decision not to walk home in the dark. But as the hours ticked by and messages went unanswered, unease set in. Calls were made. One friend hadn't seen her since the station. Another assumed she'd gotten home. No one knew anything for certain. The usual excuses started to feel thinner by the minute. The police were contacted by noon. Search units were deployed by the afternoon. By that evening, a full-scale community effort was underway. People arrived in droves, friends, classmates, teachers, even strangers from neighboring towns. They brought flashlights, boots, maps printed at home. Entire families walked shoulder to shoulder through open fields. Kayakers scanned the canals. Drones buzzed overhead. No corner was overlooked. No idea dismissed. But there was no trail. The terrain around Corser is a strange mixture of open land and dense woodland. Paths split quickly, some leading to residential pockets, others into stretches of forest with no cameras, no light. Investigators canvassed nearby roads, revisited surveillance footage from traffic cams. But there were gaps. Entire minutes of her journey went unaccounted for. And in those blank spaces, anything could have happened. Weeks passed. A vigil was held outside Emily's school. Candles burned along the sidewalk. A recording of her playing the piano filled the air, haunting, delicate, almost too soft to hear above the wind. And then, silence. Months dragged on with no new leads. The posters began to curl at the corners. Donations slowed. The media turned to newer stories. But inside the Meng home, time did not move forward. Until December. A man walking his dog through a lake bed near Bora, over 60 kilometers east, noticed something half-submerged in the reeds. At first, he thought it was an animal. Then he saw the shoe. The call came in just before 10 a.m. Within hours, the area was sealed. Helicopters circled. Forensics vans parked shoulder to shoulder along the gravel path. Divers were brought in. What they found confirmed the worst. It was Emily. Her body had been there for months, exposed to the elements, barely recognizable. The lake was quiet, rarely visited, known only to locals. Whoever left her there had done so with deliberate intent. The news shattered the town. Flags were lowered. Classes were cancelled. Neighbors gathered at the edge of the Meng family's lawn, not to intrude, but simply to be near. As if presence alone could hold some of the weight. The case officially shifted from missing person to homicide. But the trail was cold. There were no known enemies. No obvious suspects. Her phone was never recovered. Her clothing provided no useful forensic clues. Investigators broadened their scope, following up on thousands of tips, consulting criminal profilers, tracking known offenders in the area during that time frame. Still, nothing. Until nearly 7 years later. In 2023, a Danish woman narrowly escaped an attempted abduction in Sorø. She remembered a distinctive vehicle, described in vivid detail. A white utility van. Police identified the vehicle days later, registered to Philip Patrick West, a 37-year-old with a minor criminal record, mostly non-violent. But a search of his property turned up something far more disturbing. Multiple sets of women's clothing, some partially buried in the backyard. Photos. A hidden compartment in the garage. And inside, an item that had been missing since 2016, Emily Meng's bracelet. He didn't speak at first. But over the course of weeks, more connections emerged. Another attempted kidnapping. A woman who had disappeared briefly, drugged and abandoned. The puzzle pieces that had once seemed unrelated began to align. Philip was arrested and charged. His trial would span several months. For Emily's family, it wasn't closure. It was confirmation of what they had feared but never wanted to believe, that someone had taken her deliberately, someone who had watched, waited, planned. The community held another vigil in 2024, this time at the lake where she had been found. The candles returned. So did the piano. But this time, the song was louder. Stronger. The case was closed. A sentence handed down. A name in the court records. But in Korser, Emily's story isn't just about justice. It's about the questions that still linger. Who else did he follow? Anne. Could there be more? The verdict was handed down on a cold afternoon. Life imprisonment. No parole. The courtroom was silent. No gasps. No celebration. Just a kind of stillness that doesn't come from peace, only exhaustion. Emily's mother didn't speak to the press. Her father declined interviews. They held hands as they left the building, surrounded by cameras, walking straight to a waiting car. The doors closed behind them, and they were gone. Inside the courtroom, on the bench where her family had sat for months, someone had left a single white rose. No note. No message. Just the flower, resting on the worn fabric, petals beginning to fall. For investigators, the pieces had finally locked into place. For the public, the case was now solved. But for Emily's family, it wasn't over. Not even close. Because in the quiet moments, when the trial faded from headlines, when the candles had burned out, and when the lake returned to stillness, one question refused to leave them. Not how, not when. But why? Why Emily? There was no clear motive. No connection between her and the man who took her. She hadn't known him. Hadn't crossed him. Hadn't even spoken to him, as far as anyone could tell. He didn't live in her town. He didn't follow her on social media. He wasn't part of her school, her job, her family's life. So why? Why was she the one who never came home? Was it chance? Was it opportunity? Or was it something else entirely? That's the question her family still lives with. The question that haunts empty rooms, unanswered texts, a piano untouched since 2016. And as long as that question remains unanswered, the story doesn't feel finished. Story 4. March 2025. Delhi. The morning was already warm when the first call came in. A neighbor, confused. Concerned, but hesitant. He hadn't seen Saurabh in days, not since the middle of the week. No noise from the balcony. No movement behind the drawn curtains. His scooter, untouched in the parking slot below. It wasn't alarming, at first. Saurabh Rajput had a quiet routine. Former merchant navy officer. Disciplined, punctual, polite. The kind of man who waved at neighbors and always paid the milkman on time. He didn't drink. He didn't stay out late. He kept to himself and his wife, Muskin. To anyone watching from the outside, theirs was an ordinary marriage. Respectful. Stable. Unremarkable. But then the messages stopped. Texts from his cousin went unanswered. A video call scheduled with his mother was missed. His bank card hadn't been used. His phone went dark. By day 4, his family had filed a report. What began as a welfare check quickly turned into something else. Officers visited the apartment building on a quiet residential street. They knocked. Muskin answered. Calm. Cooperative. Said Sohrab had gone out on business. Claimed she wasn't sure where, he often traveled last minute. She seemed worried, but not overly so. Concerned, not panicked. She offered them water. Invited them in. The apartment was clean. Air-conditioned. A faint smell of incense lingering from the morning's prayers. Nothing seemed out of place. Nothing seemed off. But something didn't sit right. It was subtle. The silence inside the home. The way she spoke, measured. The strange pauses between sentences. The phone records, when they came in, only raised more questions. That's when investigators began widening their search. They checked CCTV footage from nearby shops. Spoke to delivery drivers. Scanned activity from his phone before it went dead. Traced purchases, movements, signals. And eventually, they found a rental. An empty space on the city's outskirts. A storage unit, rented under someone else's name. Paid for in cash. Visited only once. Inside it sat a large blue drum. Tightly sealed. Heavy. And when they broke it open, everything changed. Rain tapped steadily against the corrugated metal roof of the facility. A thin mist hung in the air, thick with the smell of concrete and rust. Officers stood back, gloves on, masks secured. The blue drum sat in the center of the room, unnatural in its stillness. Heavy. Cold. Silent. It took 3 men to move it. The seal had been reinforced with industrial tape, layers upon layers, stretched tight across the lid. Whoever placed it there had made sure it wouldn't come off easily. But it did. Eventually. And then, no one spoke. The odor hit first. Sharp. Rotten. Deep. One of the officers turned away. Another steadied himself against the wall. A forensic technician, experienced and composed, paused mid-motion and lowered her gaze. Inside the drum was cement. Hardened. But only near the top. Beneath that, fragments. A cloth. Hair. Bone. In a city used to noise, there was only the hum of the rain outside. The phone calls began almost immediately. Forensics. Command. A silent nod from the lead officer, followed by the slow zip of a body bag. As the remains were transported, news traveled quickly. At his old academy, word passed from room to room, Sohrab Rajput had been found. Not alive. Not missing. But hidden, deliberately. Buried, in the most unnatural way imaginable. In life, Sohrab had been methodical. His colleagues remembered a man who folded his clothes with precision, who stood during national anthems without needing to be asked. A man who once risked his own safety to shield a junior officer during a storm at sea. He was steady. He was kind. He was quiet. He never raised his voice. And yet, no one had heard his last. Back in the apartment, Muskin was asked to return to the station. She didn't cry. She didn't ask where he had been found. Instead, she requested a glass of water. Detectives noticed everything. The pause. The stillness. The way she kept adjusting her sleeve, almost rhythmically. She didn't deny he was missing. But she didn't ask if he was gone. When they showed her the photo, just a blurry shot of the drum, no details, she looked away. Her next call wasn't to his family. It was to someone else. A man. Name withheld from public records. A friend. A former colleague. A number saved under a different name in her phone. The story she gave in the following hours would shift. Once. Then twice. Then came the surveillance footage. The footage came from a grocery store 3 blocks from the apartment. Timestamp, March 2nd, 3 days before the missing person report was filed. It showed Muskin walking through the parking lot, alone at first. Then, 30 seconds later, a man followed. Taller than her. Wearing a baseball cap pulled low. They didn't enter together. But they left within minutes of each other. No purchases. No bags. Just glances exchanged in the reflection of the glass doors. The officers watching the footage rewound it. Then again. Then again. The man's face was partially visible in the final frame, just before he stepped out of view. But it was enough. His identity was confirmed within hours. He wasn't a stranger to the household. He was a former classmate of Muskin's. Someone who had once been close to her, years ago. Someone Sohrab had reportedly met, once, during a brief visit to her hometown. There had been no public arguments. No warnings. No one suspected anything unusual. But messages retrieved from Muskin's phone told a different story. Hundreds of them. Late-night chats. Deleted images. Private jokes. Disappearing calls. And then, one message, buried deep in a chain of routine conversations. He'll be gone by then. Trust me. It was dated just 10 days before Sohrab's disappearance. That single message rewrote the direction of the investigation. Searches intensified. The apartment was revisited. This time, they noticed things. A patch of new tiles laid clumsily in the bathroom. A receipt for concrete mix stuffed into a folder of old bank statements. A faint drag mark on the floor beneath the bed, cleaned, but not well. And in a locked drawer near the kitchen, his wallet. His ID. His wedding ring. All items that should have been with him, had he truly left on business. But he never left. They believe it happened overnight. One officer said the home felt quiet in the wrong places. That the layout made too much sense. Nothing out of place. Nothing to hold on to. Except one detail. A corner of a rug, folded back just slightly, just enough to notice something beneath it. What they found was still stained. Let me know when you're ready for the next section, the arrest, confession, and chilling final details, or if you'd like to stretch this moment even further. Absolutely. Here's the next section, unfolding the tension even further, with a slow, detailed unraveling of events leading to the arrest and confession. Still narrated. The lab results came back in under 48 hours. There were traces, minute, but unmistakable, of blood beneath the laminate flooring. Enough to match. Enough to confirm. It was Sohrab. The forensic report also noted the presence of a chemical used in cleaning industrial tools. A solvent strong enough to dull the scent of decomposition, for a while. But not forever. When the officers returned to the apartment, Muskin didn't resist. She opened the door without a word. No questions. No visible fear. She was escorted to the precinct. Quiet. Still. Her hands trembled just once, when they placed the photos on the table. Not of the drum. Not the blood. A picture of Sohrab. Laughing. In the interview room, it took 4 hours before she spoke. The first hour, she denied everything. Said she was being set up. That Sohrab had enemies. That someone had followed them once, on a late-night walk. She wept. clutched tissues, looked at the ceiling instead of the officers. Her voice was strained but controlled. By the third hour, her tone had changed. She stopped crying. Her voice became low. Even. She asked for tea. She asked what would happen if she told the truth. Then came the story. She claimed it wasn't planned. That it began with a fight. A moment of anger. That he had threatened to leave. That he had insulted her. She said he grabbed her wrist. That she pushed back. That he slipped. She said he didn't move afterward. But the autopsy disagreed. Multiple fractures. Signs of restraint. Post-mortem dismemberment. And the cement, poured while the body was still fresh. She didn't do it alone. The man from the grocery store was arrested 36 hours later in a guest house 2 cities away. He offered no resistance. Just one sentence. She told me it was already done. At trial, the details became even more grim. Messages exchanged the night of Sorub's death described timing. Tools. Disposals. There were maps. Instructions. Phrases like, make sure it's sealed, and, don't leave anything behind. But even with the confession, there was something they never fully explained. Why the drum? Why something so deliberate, so permanent? The prosecution painted it as desperation. Cold calculation masked as panic. The defense tried to argue manipulation. That Muskin had been pushed. Coerced. The court didn't agree. She was sentenced to life. So was her accomplice. But still, one question lingered in the minds of those who knew Sorub. How could someone be so careful, so precise, so aware of his surroundings, never have seen it coming? They waited for him at the station that night. His brother had driven 2 hours, with a change of clothes and Sorub's favorite cigarettes. The ones he always bought from a shop near the docks, same brand, same silver foil. His mother had made his favorite dish, packed carefully in a steel container wrapped in towels to keep it warm. She believed, up until that moment, he would walk in exhausted and smiling, asking why everyone looked so worried. But he never did. The moment the detective stepped out of the car, she knew. They didn't need to say a word. The days that followed felt unreal. The headlines were cruel. The details, worse. Friends reached out, but there was little comfort in their voices. Neighbors brought food, flowers. People they hadn't heard from in years came to offer prayers. But every corner of their home felt colder. Smaller. His room remained untouched. His boots sat by the door. His uniform, neatly pressed, still hung in the back of the wardrobe with his medals tucked in their box, unopened since his last deployment. What hurt the most, his father said, was the trust. Sorub had trusted her. He had planned a future with her. Bought that apartment with her name on the papers. Told his family that she was the kindest soul he'd ever met. And now, all they had left was silence. At the trial, they sat in the front row. They listened to every message, every call, every detail of how he was discarded like waste. Not once did she look up. Not once did she say sorry. The family was offered counseling. They refused. His mother said, I will not heal from this. I will carry it. His father said, I won't forgive her. Not in this life. And his brother, he hasn't spoken since the sentencing. Not a word. People still ask them, how could this happen? Why didn't anyone see the signs? The truth is, no one ever expects betrayal to come from inside the home. But there's a question that has never left their minds. Was it rage? Or calculation? Was it a moment of madness? Or something much colder than that? Was it premeditated, or pure evil? The story doesn't end here. Story 5. It was a gray morning in Paris. The kind of morning where the sky hangs heavy, and the damp air settles into your clothes before you even notice. A street lamp still buzzed faintly above the edge of Bois de Boulogne, even though the sun had already risen. It didn't feel like morning. It felt like waiting. A groundskeeper, clearing brush near the old jogging path, paused when his dog refused to move. The animal stood perfectly still, ears pinned back, legs locked. Not barking. Just watching. There was something in the distance. At first, he thought it was clothing. A discarded coat. Maybe someone had camped out overnight, left in a hurry. That wouldn't be unusual. This stretch of the woods, secluded, quiet, often avoided by locals, was known for its shadows. He took a few steps forward. Then stopped. It wasn't a coat. The police arrived 15 minutes later. They sealed the area with quiet urgency. There was no statement to the press. No alerts. No flashing lights. Just a quiet van, a line of tape, and officers whispering into radios. For hours, no one knew anything. And then, a name began to surface. Philippine Lenoir de Carlin. 19 years old. First-year university student. Originally from Bordeaux. A rising photography student with a portfolio full of soft colors and lonely city streets. Her friends remembered her as shy, but curious. She didn't like large crowds. Preferred bookstores to bars. Said she felt safer among pages than people. The last time anyone saw her was 3 days earlier, boarding a late tram near Gare Saint-Lazare. She had told her roommate she'd be home by midnight. She never returned. Her phone last pinged near the park. That was the last trace. No texts. No calls. Just silence. The next day, her parents made the trip to Paris. They handed out flyers. Spoke to strangers. Sat in cafes where she once studied, staring out the windows, hoping she would walk past. When the news finally reached them, it came not from the police, but from a journalist. Someone had leaked a detail. Her initials matched the ones found engraved on the silver ring recovered at the scene. It wasn't just a murder. It was a message. The papers didn't print everything. The coroner's findings were kept sealed. But whispers moved faster than ink. Girls in the nearby university were warned not to walk home alone. Messages were sent through group chats. Tips exchanged in hushed voices. One girl gone. One body in the woods. And still no explanation. At her memorial, the campus was silent. Hundreds of candles lit the steps of the library where she used to study. Someone placed her camera on the railing, its lens cracked, still holding the last photo she ever took. A blur of lights on a dark street. That image, empty, grainy, and colorless, became the symbol of everything they still didn't know. The investigation would soon turn international. A lead would appear thousands of kilometers away. But for now, in Paris, one question remained unanswered. Why Philippine? And why there? Bois de Boulogne stretches across the western edge of Paris like a forgotten memory. Once a royal hunting ground, now a maze of trees and winding paths, it's a place where elegance and silence coexist, but also where secrets go to sleep. Beneath the canopy, the light doesn't fully reach the ground. Even at noon, there are corners where time seems to pause. Locals avoid it after dark. They always have. The morning Philippine was found, it was unusually still. Not just quiet, but still. The kind of stillness that creeps under your skin. The crime scene stretched across a narrow trail where joggers sometimes passed at first light. Only now, the path was cordoned off. Evidence markers glinted against damp leaves. Officers whispered into earpieces. Philippine's backpack was found first, just off the path, resting at the base of a tree. Inside it, her student ID, a train ticket, a broken lip balm, and a folded note with a scribbled reminder, presentation due Monday. Don't forget. She'd vanished before Monday ever came. Security footage showed her leaving a bookstore near Rue de Rome around 8:13 p.m. She smiled politely at the cashier. She paid in cash. She paused at the corner, pulled her jacket tighter, and turned toward the tram line. And then, nothing. No other camera picked her up. No known witnesses came forward. Until the morning her body was found, there wasn't a single lead. But what came next, no one could have predicted. When authorities began combing through DNA recovered at the scene, they ran it against national databases. No match. Not in France. Not in any immediate neighboring countries. But then Interpol flagged something. A partial match, logged 2 years earlier in Zurich, during an unrelated arrest. A man. Mid-40s. Dual citizenship. No convictions. But a record of unusual behavior during a disturbance call. The French authorities sent a formal request. Swiss police located the man in a rural suburb, living alone in a modest apartment lined with soundproofed walls. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. He was extradited within weeks. During the initial hearings, he sat completely still. No emotion. No reaction. Just eyes that stayed fixed on the table in front of him. Investigators began building a psychological profile. They uncovered years of travel. Dozens of cities. Countless photographs. Receipts. GPS records. Nothing directly incriminating, until they noticed a pattern in his movement. He had been in Paris. He had been near Bois de Boulogne. He had purchased a one-way tram ticket. And the night Philippine disappeared, his phone had gone offline for 3 hours. They confronted him with the evidence. He remained silent. He offered no explanation. No defense. No denial. Not even her name. The courtroom sat in silence during the trial. Philippine's parents refused to speak to the press. Her best friend collapsed after testifying. The jury listened to every detail, every theory, every timeline, every small, harrowing fact. But there was one question no one could answer. Why her? Why Philippine? There were no known connections. No prior encounters. No messages. No history. Just that one moment, in the shadows of a city that never sleeps. The man was found guilty. But he never spoke a word. Not during the trial. Not during sentencing. Not since. Authorities believe there may be more victims. More names. More places. But so far, silence. And the truth, whatever it is, remains buried somewhere between the trees. He never confessed. And no one knows what else he's hiding. Story 6. Long Island's southern edge stretches into the Atlantic, its beaches battered by decades of tide and storm. But there's a place near the barrier islands where the wind doesn't just whisper through the dunes, it carries something heavier. Gilgo Beach. Endless sand. A sharp wind that never really dies. Salt in the air. Fog that settles in low and stays too long. There are no bright lights here. Only scattered cottages, dunes stacked like dunes, and silence after dark. That's where the first body turned up. December 2010. A cadaver wrapped in burlap, half buried in tall grass. Then another. And another. And then, a fourth. Within days, Suffolk County authorities realized they weren't dealing with a one-off crime. They had stumbled upon a graveyard. And this wasn't recent. These remains stretched back years. Possibly decades. The pattern wasn't in how the bodies were arranged. It wasn't in the materials or the locations. It was in the distance between them. Almost evenly spaced. As if someone had returned, methodically, deliberately, time and again. The public didn't know what to make of it. Reporters descended. Helicopters hovered. But answers? There were none. And the timeline only grew more complicated. One victim had vanished in 1996. Another in 2003. A third in 2007. Many of them had disappeared without a trace, last seen walking to meet a client, or leaving a motel, or waiting outside a bar. They were young women. Most worked in the same line of work. Most had used Craigslist. And all of them had disappeared without their phones ever pinging again. Detectives began retracing steps. But it was like trying to map a storm that had already passed. Over time, the case grew cold. Press coverage faded. Tips stopped coming in. The dunes grew taller. But the families never stopped asking. One mother kept every voicemail her daughter had ever left. Another refused to leave her house, afraid she'd miss a call. Some lit candles every year on the day they vanished. Others stopped celebrating birthdays altogether. And all of them kept asking the same question. Why can't they catch him? It wasn't until 2022 that something shifted. A task force, quietly reassembled, began to re-examine the original files. But this time, they had tools they didn't have before. New DNA sequencing. Advanced cell tower analysis. Deep metadata pulls from older records. And one name began to surface. A man who'd lived in Massapequa Park. A family man. An architect. A client of many escort services. Someone who had quietly operated in the shadows, while leading an otherwise unremarkable life. His name, Rex Hoyerman. But it wasn't just his phone records. It wasn't just the burner phones or the browser history or the suspicious travel timelines. It was how easily he had hidden in plain sight. He matched witness sketches from years earlier. His physical appearance was consistent. His access to certain locations aligned. When police began watching him, they noticed something else. He was still using fake phones. Still researching cold cases. Still reading about the victims. They moved in quietly. He never expected it. But even after his arrest, the question still hangs. How many more are out there? How many nights did he walk the shoreline before anyone noticed? And how long had he been doing it before the first body was ever found? Will we ever know how many victims there really were? They called it the Long Island serial killer case. Others named it the Gilgo 4. Some simply referred to it as the beach graves. But no matter what name you gave it, the truth remained, this was a crime that haunted the silence. A case where every clue seemed to vanish as quickly as it appeared. When Rex Hoyerman was arrested in 2023, the press swarmed again. Cameras outside his house. Reporters interviewing neighbors. People asking how no one had ever suspected a thing. But that arrest, for all the headlines it created, only raised more questions than it answered. Where was he in 2011? What happened to the women who disappeared before the original 4? And what about the bodies that didn't quite match the others? The ones buried deeper, wrapped differently, or found further away. Forensics teams pored over evidence, storage units, computer hard drives, receipts from years past. There were photos. Drawings. Maps. Disturbing searches. Enough to indict. But maybe not enough to convict on every count. Meanwhile, the families watched from the courtroom, clinging to each piece of testimony, each photograph. Some with hope. Some with hollowed eyes. All of them waiting for something resembling closure. But there's no real closure in cases like this. The dunes still stretch endlessly at Gilgo Beach. The wind still moves in sudden, sharp gusts. And even now, late at night, you might hear something out there. Waves crashing against the shore. A phone buzzing. A voice calling out, carried by the wind. Maybe it's just the sea. Or maybe some stories never end. They just get quieter. And so ends this journey through 6 disturbing true crime cases, each of them different, each of them unforgettable. Which one stayed with you the most? Was it the unresolved questions around a tech mogul's final moments? A mother's decades-old secret? A teenager's walk home that ended in silence? A husband's disappearance sealed inside cement? The haunting discovery beneath Parisian trees? Or the decades of death scattered along a shoreline? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you're still listening. If the rain outside still hasn't lulled you to sleep. There's always another story waiting in the dark. Subscribe if you'd like to hear more.